story. Back in the 1200s, there were a group of heretics called the Cathars. They're also known as the Albigensians, and they were in southern France. They didn't believe in the real presence. They didn't believe in the sacraments at all. They kind of looked like they were Catholic, but they weren't. They were pagan, because they didn't believe anything that we really believed. And yet, they were pretty good people. They tried to live decent and good lives, but they didn't believe in marriage, they didn't believe in anything. And the way society was structured right then, they were a threat to society. They really were, because they were going to, once you struck at the heart of marriage, you kind of disintegrated society. And so Pope Innocent III called a crusade against them. And so the knights went out to southern France and whacked and killed tens of thousands of people in trying to wipe out this heresy. And the Cathars got very good at hiding. And how they did it, they hid among the regular Christians, because they looked just like them, and they would go to Sunday Mass. It didn't mean anything to them, but they would go. So the church said, we're going to force them out. And so they instituted what's called the Easter duty. You had to go to communion at least once a year. We still have that, don't we? That's still a rule and still a law. And that meant you also had to go to confession at least once a year. If you had not committed a moral sin, and they figured everybody had, so they had to go to confession. Now, some of you might remember the really old confessionals when you were a kid. Kids are always inquisitive. What always amazed me is that at the bottom of the screen, there was this little divot in the wood. And, we'd love to put our fingers through that, because if you put your finger through that, the priest could probably see your finger, waving there. Do you know why that was there? Because in the day of the Cathars, and then they just kept it, in the day of the Cathars, if you went to confession, the priest would slide a little ticket through there, which meant that you had gone to confession. And you would take that, and you would present that to the priest at Easter, so that you would receive the Eucharist. You could receive the Eucharist. Now, the Cathars would not go to confession, so they wouldn't have a ticket. And so that's how they were, fleshed out in the community and arrested. Isn't that cool? I mean, it's to think that came all the way down to, not that it was cool for them, but it's kind of an interesting point, for people that lasted down to our day and age. So if you ever see a confessional like that, it's kind of a relic, but that's why it has it. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with the Eucharist part, but it's such a good story, I have to tell you, about the Cathars. So things were written, this was a very tough Inquisition, and they really were a danger. I mean, people think the church is always wrong for crusades. It isn't. They were a real threat to the society. Society would have collapsed if the Cathars would have won. And so they were kind of wiped out. But in the town of Béziers, there were about 25,000 people in that town. It was a walled town. And the problem was the Cathars had taken refuge in the town and with the fellow Catholics, with other Catholics. And the Catholics allowed them to do that. So this is back in the days when you had warrior abbots of monasteries, and they'd wear their metal miters and their armor, and they were sitting on their horse, and they're with the nobles, and the nobles are there, and the nobles come up to the abbot, and they say to him, or to the armored bishop, and they said, the town of Béziers is surrounded. We're about to break in. The problem is, the Cathars look exactly like the Catholics. How will we tell them apart? And the abbot, without breaking stride, said, kill them all. God will know his own. And that's what they did. They executed all 25,000 people, figuring that the Catholics would go immediately to heaven, and the Catholics would go immediately to hell. And since that was their eternal destiny, that was just the right thing to do. I mean, we are just, whoa. I mean, my brain can't hold that, but that actually happened. I had to share that with you because that's just one of those stories that you have to learn if you're Catholic. You have to learn those kinds of trivia things, okay? Anyway, back to the point at hand. So, we're in the middle of this time when transubstantiation becomes the word on how we figure out what's the Eucharist and how does it work, okay? So, I think that we got too involved in that because even how I've described that to you right now is difficult. And yet, transubstantiation is the way we understand how this happens, and it does work. It does work that way. But I still think it's pretty difficult for people to understand. That's why I just wish people would accept the fact that we have always believed that the bread and wine are changed entirely into the body and the blood of Christ. Now, Lutherans don't quite believe that. When they have Eucharist, they believe that the bread and wine is changed into the body and blood of Christ, but that the bread and wine still stay bread and wine. That's called consubstantiation. That's not what we believe, okay? And of course, you'll say, yeah, but that seems like, semantics. But the problem is, remember, they don't have a priesthood anymore. And as we'll learn in just a second, you can't have a real Eucharist without a priesthood. We'll show you why that is. Okay? And then there's the Methodists, let's do the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians, they're even less believing than the Lutherans. They just believe that the bread and wine is bread and wine, and Christ just kind of spiritually hovers over it. Okay? And then the evangelical Protestants don't even believe that. They simply believe that the bread and wine is just a remembrance of what Jesus did. It doesn't have anything to do with Jesus there. So if you're a Lutheran, and if you're a Methodist, and if you're an evangelical, what do you do if you're having a communion Sunday? What do you do with the leftover communion? Put it in a tabernacle? No, you throw it away in the garbage because it's not Jesus. Okay? And so when Catholics see that happen, we just go, wow, how could you do that? Because when the Eucharist falls on a non-porous thing, sometimes you have to wash it off 7 times, to make sure that you have it completely clean. But for the Protestants, that they aren't being sacrilegious. They just don't believe it's Jesus. So what's the big problem? And that's a good point, isn't it? What's the big problem? They don't believe what we believe. Okay? Now, if you turn to this middle section here, the last thing we're going to do tonight, and it takes me about 15 minutes to do that, is show you why you also need a priesthood to have the Eucharist. Why you can't just, have little Johnny who likes to play Mass at home make some Eucharist for you. Or why during COVID, as if some people really wanted this, we can't just hold the bread up to the TV and have the priest, through the magic of, the media, change your bread, your Wonder Bread, into the body and blood of Christ. And I want to say this is my opinion, but I'm not the only priest that feels this way. We did a terrible job during COVID. Do you realize how many Catholics no longer come to Mass because of COVID? Why? Because we said it was okay to watch Mass on TV. Well, if it's okay to watch Mass on TV when it's COVID, why wouldn't it be okay to watch Mass on TV when it's not COVID? It's okay one time, not okay the next time. It's crazy. I think we did such, and I'm going to be critical of the bishops, and I don't care if they know it, they wimped out. They really did. They said, the secular government says we can't meet, so we can't. Wrong. We should have kept the Mass going in the church. Anyone who wanted to could still come. We'd understand if you wouldn't come, but we wouldn't pretend that you were attending Mass by watching it on TV. Now, some people say, well, what about the Mass for the shut-ins? People like watching it. Yes, that's really cool for shut-ins, but it's not the Mass. It's not the same. They're watching it on TV, and they're not having the Eucharist. COVID decimated our church. It decimated it in such a way that we have not recovered from it yet. It will go down in history as one of the worst things that ever happened to the Catholic Church. And it's all because our leadership screwed it up. We kowtowed too much to this. Do do you really think the secular authority has the power to tell us how to practice our religion? Do you think the early church felt that the Roman Empire had the power to tell them how to celebrate the Eucharist? No, they would die before they would let the Roman Empire tell them how to celebrate the Eucharist. Us, not so much. Oh yes, of course. Of course, Governor, we'll do whatever you say. You know? And we did, and we lost our people. Oh my God, I think we probably lost 30 to 35% of our people. And we are only now just starting to get them back. I help out at St. Rita's every week. So the first year after COVID, there were no young people that came to Sunday Mass. None, no kids. Now, I have kids back. I have young people back, high school people, middle school people, young kids, you know? But all because people have been scared into believing that, you know, coming to church we just weren't being good citizens. Now, don't get me wrong. When there is a pandemic, of course, you have to be very careful that people are not contagious. But we knew very, very early on that people were really not that contagious, you know. And people who were in ill health or fragile health shouldn't come. We knew that. And we knew back then, too, that there was, as we know now, as science will tell you now, masks were not working. They don't work. Not for COVID. And they'll tell you that very clearly now. Even Dr. Fauci mentions it, you know? And so, you know, I think we didn't listen to our faith and to our belief system strong enough. I think there was a way that we, you know, many of us priests developed some cool ways of handling this. We were thinking of having drive-by communion. I thought that was a good idea. We were forbidden to do that. We were thinking of having drive-by confession. We were forbidden to do that. And you know, that's ridiculous. And so we damaged the faith of an entire generation. Now, don't feel bad. It worked that way in education too, didn't it? We've damaged an entire generation because of the way we treated education during COVID. So as a people, not just as Catholics, but as a people, you know, we didn't handle this very well. And we're suffering terribly from it. We're never going to get those kids back to where they should be in education. Just as it's going to be problematic getting those Catholics who have left us back to us as well. Okay? Had to say that because, you know, you got to love the Eucharist enough to fight for it when you can. Okay? So, if you look at this, how does the blood of Christ save us? This is basically the idea that when you get rid of the idea of sacrifice, you get rid of the idea of real presence. In every religion, how do you contact God, or what passes as the gods? How do you do it? This is where you got to know how religions work. All religions work this way. You have to have a sacrifice. It can be fruits of the field. It can be animals. It sometimes, in perverted religions, can be humans. It was that way to have you had a sacrifice in Jewish religion. That's what the temple was. It's where you sacrifice animals and pigeons and things like that for the various rites and rituals that Jews had. And in Christianity, you have to have a sacrifice too, if you're going to meet God. Now, remember our Jewish roots. So if you follow this, it'll make sense. Sacrifice, number one, is done to restore right relationship or offer praise and gratitude. In a Jewish sacrifice, it wasn't the killing of the animal that was important. It was the blood. So the blood was seen as the source of life. And God and humanity became one in the blood as the animal is sacrificed. And when the blood of the sacrifice was poured over the people who were dead in sin, spiritual life was restored. So when Moses comes down from the mountain and he wants to seal the covenant in the Jewish people, Israelite people, they sacrifice animals and the blood is literally sprinkled on the people, which is why they always wear brown. It doesn't make so much of a mess on the clothes. But they're sprinkling the people with the blood. And if you're going to be saved or your sins forgiven, you have to be touched with the blood of the sacrifice. You have to touch it. It isn't just, yeah, thanks for doing it. You don't have to hit me with that. Thanks for doing it. That's why, like, when I sprinkle holy water at Easter time to people, I always love to soak people. To remember your baptism, you should be touched by the waters of baptism. Okay, which does stand as for the sacrifice of Christ. Right? So, that's how the Jews did it. Well, remember, Christ came from the Jews. And so, when we look at his cross and resurrection, he sacrifices himself on the cross. Okay? He actually becomes, the sacrifice, the altar, and the priest who sacrifice. He becomes all these things at once. But his death is seen as a sacrifice. There's a problem there, isn't it? Because if his death is a sacrifice, how does he save everybody? Not just people in his day and age, but us now. How does that work? Because you have to be touched by the sacrificial blood, don't you? Now, to my mind, there were only a few people at the foot of the cross. John and Mary and a couple of the other Marys. And blood drips on them, so they get saved. But what about the other apostles who ran away? How were they saved? How were they touched by the blood of Christ? Well, this is the genius of Jesus. When he invents the sacrament of the Eucharist, where on the night before he dies, he picks up the bread and says, "This, my body." Hebrew doesn't have an is in it. It's just, "This, my body," picks up the chalice. "This, my blood." It doesn't say, "seems to be my body" or "seems to be my blood." He identifies it with his body and blood. And he says, when you eat this and when you drink this blood, you will be saved. And what he's doing is, he's making this Eucharist a way to participate in what happens on the cross. So he knows that in order to save everybody, he's got to give people a way to be at that sacrifice. Okay? So how does he do it? Well, he does it through developing this sacrament. So that in a kind of a mysterious, wonderful way, when you eat his body and drink his blood, you are there at Calvary, you are there at his resurrection, and you are there at his ascension. And you have to have it, touch it, in order to be saved. And this is just, it's just one sacrifice. We don't re-sacrifice Christ. So it's got to be the sacrifice of Calvary that we get. And so I think it's brilliant what he did. But let me show you, just flip the page here. Let me show you how this actually works when we have the Eucharist. And this gets into him being the glorified Christ. So, I've done this with people for many years. I've improved it, I'd like to think, over the years, so it's even easier to understand. If you get this, your whole idea of the Eucharist will change. So, Jesus died on the cross 2,000 years ago to save us. He sacrificed his life to save us from sin. Does anybody disagree with that? Okay, so you got to accept each one of these as we go along. So if you have a problem with it, stop. B, the Father said yes to the worthiness of this sacrifice, and he raised his Son from the dead. That's what the resurrection is. It's the yes of the Father to the Son, saying, what you did was wonderful. Live, live. Okay, so the Father says yes, Jesus rises from the dead. Now, the Father says, live at my right hand. So in the Creed, when we say Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father, we don't mean that there's a floating throne up on a cumulus cloud that Jesus sits on, buffeted by the winds here and there, next to his heavenly Father. That's not what that means. What it means when we say that Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father is this. Eternity isn't the past, present, or future. Eternity is an eternal now. Now. Always happening. The Father still is ratifying the sacrifice of Christ. When he said yes back 2,000 years ago, he never stopped saying yes to what the Son did. Okay? He still says yes. And that is why salvation is not just a past event, it happens now. And you know, the ascension, when the apostles see Jesus rising, they've been with him for 40 days and 40 nights with his resurrection. When they see him ascend to heaven, they know that that is the Father enthroning him at his right hand. And that enthronement means the sacrifice of Christ on the cross never stops. It continues its saving action through the resurrection and through the ascension. It's still occurring. The only question is, how are human beings going to plug into it? How are we going to get touched by that sacrifice? Okay? Are we following me, someone? Someone? Okay? Okay. So, when we come together as a church, we're the body of Christ. So at the altar we say, we want to be a part of this saving event, Lord. We want to be saved. We do what you ask us to do. We remember what you did for us. We offer ourselves with this bread and wine. Save us. And the Father, who eternally says yes to his Son's sacrifice, sees our desire to be united with Christ. And he says yes to us. And the minute he says that, we are put in the river of salvation. We are put in that eternal moment where God says yes to his Son, Jesus. So by doing what Christ asks us to do, we plug into an event that happened 2,000 years ago and has never ended. It's still going on. So the Eucharist becomes a bridge between eternity and history. That's why we have this place right here. This is a thin place. It is a bridge between eternity and history. It is where the supernatural meets the natural and becomes real for us. Okay? God reaches in and makes us part of something that happened 2,000 years ago and is still occurring. The bread and wine become Christ's body and blood. And because we offer these humble gifts, when God accepts them and they become Christ, we become part of that sacrifice. And we're united with Jesus. The cross and the resurrection become a present event for us, don't they? We're there at Calvary. We're there at the resurrection. We're there at the ascension. But in a special way. So when we eat that bread and drink that cup, we're receiving not the Jesus that walked the hills of Galilee, but the crucified, resurrected, and ascended Jesus, who is still saving us. We must be touched by that sacrifice in order to be saved. Isn't that what Jesus said? Unless you eat this bread and drink this cup, you will not be saved. You must partake of me. St. Augustine had a great idea when he said, you know, for most things, when we eat food, the food becomes part of us. But when we eat the Eucharist, we become part of God. That's a magnificent saying. And that's how God lives in us and saves us. And do you understand why you might have been a little upset last night when I said, you know, for our Protestant evangelical brothers and sisters, they're just born again once, which is real for them. But they never experience that again. Not so with us. We experience it every time we receive the Eucharist. Do you have any idea how strong that makes us? Do you have any idea how spiritually powerful that makes us? If we only would begin to realize that, we really could be doing miracles that the early church did. Because they really understood this. We just don't have enough faith. We don't. You know? And our faith needs to be strengthened for us to really experience the kind of salvation that Christ is offering us. And if you could really experience this to the max, don't you think you'd be at Mass willingly? Yeah. And if someday you got up and said, oh, I don't want to go to Mass. I just know it's going to be boring this week because we got, you know, certain music I don't like and this, that, and the other thing. Except then you would say to yourself, but God asked me to be there. God did. Who am I to say no to God? You know, Catholics get all, bent out of shape when we still say that to miss Mass deliberately is a mortal sin. But that's such a negative way to look at it. The reason we say that is because God asked us to be here. To deliberately walk away from that is really an insult to God. And God doesn't like that. You know? Who are we to do that? Remember, our relationship with God is not an equal one. He's God, we are not. We're still friends, but it's a difference in quality. He's better than we are. So, when you look at this, you really understand that you really are receiving Christ when you know that the sacrifice is present in you when you receive communion. And this is where the priesthood comes in. In every religion, who does the sacrifice? The priest. Without a priest, there is no sacrifice. Without a sacrifice, there's no real presence. So, back to the Lutherans. The Lutherans are pretty close to Catholics, but they don't have a real Eucharist because they got rid of their priesthood. And the Anglicans, or the Episcopalians, as we call them here, they have priests, but they're not in union with Rome. So their priesthood is straying. They don't have a real Eucharist. And the other denominations are even farther apart from that. So you can't just remember Jesus into existence. You have to have a sacrifice. Then you'll really receive Jesus. Okay, that's heavy stuff, but it will change the way you look at the Eucharist. Now, before I go on and end this, what questions do you have? Yes?
Going back to the previous page, underneath that picture of my hand, it says, "Take it, this is my body, this is my blood, the covenant which is poured out for many." I've been at Mass before where he substitutes the word all for many.
Okay, did you all hear that? He was saying how on the previous page, we usually don't let you go back there. That usually confuses me, and I know it's a trick question. But no, that's a good question, actually. So, he says at the bottom of that page, it says, get the exact way that goes, so I don't screw it up. Okay, take this as my body of the blood, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. He's been at masses where sometimes the priest says, for all. Well, you remember that a little differently than what it really is. Remember, 10 years ago, the Mass changed a bit. We changed the prayers and the words. We retranslated the Missal. And before it said for all, that's a bad translation. The actual words, and Pope Benedict is the one that insisted on this. Many of his contemporaries said, oh yeah, now it should say for all, it's more inclusive. That was when we tried to get woke. And Benedict said, but that's not the translation. The translation is for many. And so he put for many back in. And you should never hear for all again. It should always be for many, because that's what we're meant to say, okay? And that's a very good question. Now, the reason why people objected to what Benedict was saying is, we want to say that Jesus died for all. Well, Jesus did die for all, but the only ones that get saved are the many who accept him. You have to accept him in order to be saved. He doesn't save you against your will, and that's why we kept the words for many, because it isn't everybody. There are people who walk away from Christ, and Christ saves no one against their will. He lets you make up your mind. Okay, other questions? Yes?
Well, it's not a question, but I want to say, share something what you said many years ago when you stood at that pulpit. And I really don't remember your homily, but I do remember what you said about St. Augustine. In your comment that relates to what we're talking about at the Eucharist here, you said, when you come to communion, remember, become what you receive. And that's what I remember when I come. But you said it many years ago.
You're right. In case you didn't hear that, he said I was the best homilist he got. is another one of the very famous quotes of Augustine. St. Augustine saying, receive the Eucharist and become what you receive. And again, remember I just told you before, we eventually got the idea with the Eucharist that we weren't just receiving salvation, but we were also receiving a command to go out and be Christ to others. That's what Augustine meant when he says, become who you receive when you receive the Eucharist. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a great quote from St. Augustine. Would have done also better if you said I wasn't best honest. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
Back in the early churches that were held in like the rich women's households, because they also partake in communion, yes.
Right.
Who was the priest that consecrated the host?
Okay, good question. In the early church, because these were in houses with women, wealthy women providing the thing, who was the priest actually that presided over the Eucharist? And I'm glad you brought that up because I had forgotten. I need to talk about that. Because in the Catholic Church we have a law, or it's a royal law, it's a dogma, that only men can be priests. Okay, and it was back in those days that way too. Now there is some discussion whether there were women deacons. Well, there were women deacons, but they weren't deacons like men deacons. The reason, does anybody know why we had women deacons? Because when you were baptized without any clothes on. And we did not let men go into the same water as women to baptize women. We just didn't do that. Instead, the man deacon would still baptize, but he would probably not be in the water. And the one who would be closest to the woman was a woman deaconess, who would take care that her virtue was maintained, that things were chaste and acceptable and things like that. That's what the women deaconesses did, but it was a different type of a deacon. And so they're still arguing over that, but there's not going to be women deaconesses, and there certainly will not be women priests. Pope John Paul II, was emphatic on that. And I got to thinking, because people have oftentimes said, well, the church will eventually change on that. Oh my gosh. If you follow at all the discussion over whether we should bless couples in irregular unions, not just gay unions, but also irregularly married unions, and you've seen the uproar across the world over that. Do you think we're ever going to really approach the women deaconesses and priests, male priests or women priests again? No. This thing of blessings that we had earlier this year nearly broke the church apart. Now, I happen to think that Pope Francis was right to do what he did, but remember, in Africa, they can't do that there because it's against the law. And the African bishops reminded the Pope of that, and he said, yes, I know that. You're going to have to adjust that, to make sure that you're culturally acceptable. So I understand why you can't do that there. But, that's a whole other thing for another moral talk. But what I'm trying to tell you is it was such an uproar to make such a change like that we're still not through all that yet. And major changes on who celebrates the Eucharist and stuff is not going to come to the Catholic Church. It's just not ever going to come to the Catholic Church. Because John Paul, basically made it a dogma that the priest in the tradition of the church and in Judaism is male, and it's going to stay that way. Okay? Other questions? Thank you for that. That was a good one. Yes?
This is a big bugaboo of mine. You just brought all opened up. There were always women with Christ. Magdalene's there, right with it. I don't understand why the church is so anti-feminist.
Well, that's a very good question. So she's making a comment that there were always women with Christ. Why would we discriminate against women who were always with Christ and not let them be priests? Well, there are some really good answers to that. The first one is the Blessed Mother. The Blessed Mother is not a priest. And yet, she is the most perfect Christian. She is the most perfect Christian, but she's not a priest, which should tell us that the priesthood is not to be a position of power, but a position of service. However, in our culture and over the centuries, priests have, basically had the reins of power in the church. That is wrong. And that can change. We may always have to have priests to do the Eucharist, but they don't always have to be the ones who absolutely and only run the church. Let me give you an example of that. It's possible, if you had a bold pope, you could do it. It's possible for women to be cardinals. There's no reason. Nobody says a cardinal has to be male. And there's no reason why women could not be in the highest echelons of the governing of the church. In fact, Pope Francis, whose birthday is today, by the way, he's 87, he has put women in real primary positions of power. And he has said they can actually run departments of the church. Well, that would be really something if that really comes to pass. And so, he's opened the possibility for women to have equal shares of power. And I think I think you bring up a really good point, because, what do we call St. Mary Magdalene? We call her the first among the apostles, because she was the first one to see the risen Christ and accept him, So, but, Jesus, there's no question that he held women in great dignity. But he did not see the priesthood as an either-or thing, as, all the power is going to go to the male section here, and the females you're just going to have to serve. That was not how it worked in his ministry, and that's not how it should work now. Okay? So, this is something that I've had to come to deal with over the years, because I was brought up in a good male-ordered household, pretty bonanza-like when you think about it. And, and I was uncomfortable with that idea, but I can't be uncomfortable with that idea, So I'm willing to, accept the dogma part. I accept that, and I think it has to be that way. But there's no reason why women cannot function in equal power in the church. And they are doing much more now than they had in the past. Much more. And as you know, even in the past, who ran the church? The parish secretary. You knew that. But seriously, women have always run the church. I used to get mad at the nuns who forsook teaching in our schools because they wanted to have more power in the church. And I thought, how much more power in the church could you have than molding the minds of the young? I was so influenced by the nuns who formed me. They're the reason I'm a priest, for Pete's sake. And they could be very persuasive, as we know. So, when you think about it, in reality, the way it's actually functioned in the church, women have had a lot of power. I loved it when we used to go to Ireland, you go to Kylemore Abbey, and you look at all the abbesses of Kylemore Abbey who have been around for a couple hundred years. Guess what they're all wearing? Can you tell me what they're wearing? A mitre. They wear a mitre. And guess what they have in their hand? A crozier. Do you know why? Because the mitre and the crozier are symbols of ecclesiastical administration. And these abbesses ran great tracts of land along with their monasteries. And they had, some of them were far more powerful than regular bishops. But we forget that. We just don't even think about that. But there they are, in their portraits, wearing a mitre, and they still can do that. And some of them still do. I just watched on TikTok or something like that. Amazing what you can see on TikTok. In Africa, there was a new woman abbess installed. And what does she have? A crozier. And I hadn't seen that in a while. I thought, that's pretty cool. So let's not think that the church is, as sexist as you might think. It's not. But we still have a long ways to go. Other questions? Oops. Anybody else? Yes.
What about our people that go to the Greek church and they have the Greek priests? How do they get into our religion?
Okay, so what about the Greek Orthodox? Here's the deal with the Greek Orthodox. They have what's called the apostolic succession, just like we do. They trace their priesthood and their bishops all the way back to the apostles, and they can do that. And they did. It's an unbroken thing. So the Archbishop of Constantinople is as real of a bishop as the Pope. But they're not in union with the Pope right now. It's a schism, not a heretical break. You know, we've just got a few things we don't agree with. But our priesthood and our sacraments remain the same. The way it works is this: if you can't go to a Catholic church and you're near a Greek Orthodox church, go there and go to communion. It's the real body and blood of Christ. And a Greek Orthodox can do the same with us. Here's the problem. We don't have any problem with a Greek Orthodox person receiving communion in our church. We'll give them communion anytime. We'll even marry them in our church. But the Greek Orthodox have a real problem with us receiving communion in their case. Not because they don't think we believe, but you know why it is? It's because we sacked Constantinople back in the year 1200. and you know, we kind of laugh at it, and I kind of laugh at it too, but they have never forgotten it, because we took everything. We took everything. You know those wonderful lions that are outside the church in Florence? Or is it Venice? No, it's Florence. They have the lions. We took them from Constantinople. And we took St. Andrew from Constantinople. And we took St. John Chrysostom from Constantinople too. We took a lot of stuff. And recently the popes have been giving them back. Okay? Which makes the Orthodox, you'd think that would make them happy? No, they just see it as their just desserts. We should have it back. Doesn't make them any friendlier toward us. But you know, the bottom line is, we can share sacraments with each other, and we do. Okay? Does that help answer that? Okay. Any other? Yes.
That's what we refer to as the Great Schism.
Say it again.
Is that what is referred to as the Great Schism?
Yeah, that's what's no. The Great Schism happened before that. It happened. The Great Schism, what separated the East from the West churches, happened in the year 1054, when the Pope and the Archbishop of Constantinople excommunicated each other because things weren't going real well. We had done a few things. We put a little extra thing in the creed that the Holy Spirit proceeds also from the Son. I mean, can you imagine breaking up over that? But that's what they did. They didn't like it. And Charlemagne thought it should be in. The Archbishop of Constantinople thought it shouldn't. So that strained things. And then finally in the year 1054, we excommunicated each other. That's the Great Schism. But because of that, when the Crusaders took a by road to Constantinople on their way to the Holy Land, they thought it was okay to rape and pillage and wreck the city of Constantinople and take over the empire, which they did. So Crusaders could be rather tough. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so now, tomorrow night, we're going to talk much more practically speaking about the Mass. We can pick up some other questions about communion and other things, other controversial things, perhaps, that we haven't talked about yet. But tonight was the night I really wanted you to be thinking a little bit about this new way of understanding how the Eucharist works. So would you do me a favor, and tomorrow, if you get a chance, just read this over again and see if it makes sense. It should make sense. So if I have not been clear, what should make sense is those last 2 pages. Okay, if you get that, you've gotten the basic things of what I want to talk about. But read it over, see if you understand it. If you don't, please quiz me tomorrow so we can make it clear. And then we're going to talk about the Mass and that there's much more within the Mass than what you think. And once again, it's going to make you so proud to be Catholic. And once you know these things, you'll never want to be anything else but. Okay? So thank you very much. Thanks for coming tonight. Drive safely home. Be careful. See you later.